Aristotle's Categories is a work of ontology. That is, it is about onta, beings, or what there is. He is interested in classifying the kinds of beings there are, and within that classification, he wants to identify the beings that are the most fundamental, important, or real. Let's look now at the fourfold classification of beings that he generates in Chapter 2, and then see how he uses that classification to identify the most fundamental realities. Aristotle generates this fourfold ontology by invoking the two subject-predicate relations that we've been examining, being said of a subject and being in a subject. He thinks you can sort anything that is into one of four categories by asking two questions about it. Is it said of a subject? Yes or no? And is it in a subject? Yes or no? Harry Potter fans can think of these as the two questions asked by the sorting hat at the Aristotelian Institute of Ontology. We've just seen that the distinction between being said of a subject and not being said of any subject amounts to the distinction between universals and particulars. Thus, human being is a universal, which is said of Socrates, a particular. And Labrador retriever, dog, and animal are universals that are said of the particular Labrador retriever, Fido. Okay, so that's the east-west distinction. What about the north-south distinction? This concerns whether an entity is in a subject. Recall Aristotle's definition of being in a subject, or, as we've been calling it, inherence. What belongs to something, not as a part, and cannot exist separately from what it is in. We saw how this is the relation in which walking stands to Socrates. Walking is an activity of Socrates. It is the sort of thing that cannot exist without being the activity of something. This is also the relation in which brown stands to Fido. Supposing Fido is one of those beautiful chocolate brown Labrador retrievers. So walking and brown are inherent items, while Socrates and Fido are not. Things like colors, shapes, locations, activities, and so on go below the line, since they exist only by inhering in subjects like Socrates or Fido. But Socrates and Fido don't inhere in anything more fundamental, so they go above the line. In Chapter 4, Aristotle introduces the term substance to refer to the subjects of inherent items, those above the line. Socrates and Fido are substances. Now, what should we call the items that go below the line, beyond the fact that they inhere in substances? In Chapter 4, Aristotle just gives us a list: quality, quantity, activity, and so on. The list, however, provides us with a way of classifying the sorts of things that inhere in substances such as Socrates and Fido. That is, he's enumerating the sorts of things that can be said of the particular items that inhere in Socrates or Fido. For example, take brown, which is in Fido. What is it? Brown is a color. So color is said of brown. That means color goes in the right-hand column because it's a universal, but below the line because it inheres in a subject. Now, just as in the case of the universals above the line, where we can ask, what is a dog, and get the answer, it is an animal, we can ask further of color, below the line, what is it? And eventually, we are going to get the answer, color is a quality. So quality goes in this quadrant as well. Note that quality is one of the 10 categories of being that are listed in Chapter 4, where Aristotle says that every entity invoked in a predication is either a substance, or a quantity, or a quality, or relative, or where, or when, or being in a position, or having, or acting, or undergoing. Indeed, all those categories other than substance, that is, quality, quantity, position, relation, activity, and so forth, all of these will end up in the lower right quadrant of our fourfold classification. Aristotle is proposing these as the highest universals in the category of inherent entities. Note that acting, which is on the list of these universals in Chapter 4, will be said of walking, since walking is an action, something you do. Okay, to sum up Aristotle's fourfold classification of beings, it arises from the combination of two distinctions between universals and particulars on the one hand, that's the east-west distinction, and between substances and inherent items on the other. That's the north-south distinction. This yields four basic kinds of beings: universal substances, universal inherent properties, particular inherent properties, and particular substances. Now, there is some dispute about how to understand the east-west distinction south of the line, that is, between universals and particulars in the case of inherent entities. But that complication need not concern us here. What's important for our purposes is the direction of the having a subject relation. Recall that to have a subject is to be dependent on a more fundamental underlying entity. If we draw arrows pointing to the subject on which an entity depends, we'll be able to see pretty clearly which category Aristotle singles out as most important and why. First, we can note the east-west dependence. Universals have particulars as their subjects, so the arrows of dependence go towards the particulars. Now the north-south dependence. Inherent items have as their subjects the substances in which they inhere. Now to identify the most fundamental beings. Which category serves as the subject to every other, either directly or indirectly? It is the category of particular substances. All other entities are either said of them as subjects, those are the universal substances, or in them as subjects, those are the particular inherent items, or have as their subjects items that do one of these two things. Those are the universal inherent items. And note, there are no arrows of dependence leading away from particular substances. These have no subjects, but they are the subjects for everything else. That makes them the most fundamental kind of being. They underlie everything, with nothing more fundamental that underlies them. That is why Aristotle calls them primary substances. He concludes in Chapter 5, what is called substance most fully, primarily, and most of all, is what is neither said of any subject nor in any subject. For instance, an individual man or horse. And all other things are either said of the primary substances as subjects or in them as subjects. As subjects for all other things, primary substances are the most important or fundamental kind of being. In fact, that's pretty much what the word translated substance means. In Greek, it is ousia, which is an abstract noun formed from the participle of the verb to be. A more literal translation would be beingness, and a perfectly good rendering would be reality, where reality stands for genuine or first class, as opposed to derivative, parasitic, or second-grade being. To call something an ousia is to confer a special, high-grade ontological status on it, something that is lost in the translation substance, since as we use the term, we tend to think of substances as things you can spread, handle, spray out of a can, or get stuck in your hair. It's not an honorific term in the way Aristotle uses ousia. Matters are even more complicated by the history of our English word substance, which originates from the Latin translation of Aristotle's word for subject, hypokeimenon, or underlying thing. But don't worry about these linguistic complications if you find them distracting. I actually love this sort of thing. The main point to keep in mind is that the term substance in our translation of Aristotle is standing in for ousia, which we can think of as the gold medal winner in the ontological Olympics. With this understanding of ousia, we can see that it has the ontological status that Plato attributed to his intelligible forms. So now we can articulate the ontological dispute between Plato and Aristotle. Plato thought that the entities that deserve the title ousia, the most fundamental entities, are suprasensible intelligible forms. Aristotle, by contrast, thought that the most basic realities are those that serve as subjects for all the rest, and these are such ordinary entities as human beings and other animals.